Good evening, everyone. I'm Paul Skinner, founder of Marketing Kind. I'm joined this evening by our very own Mindy, Emsley, who will be co-hosting the conversation with me, and of course our very special guest, Juliet Davenport. Just by way of preliminary introduction, in case there are one or two people who are new to Marketing Kind, we are a non-profit community of marketers and change makers who believe that the world's most pressing problems depend on human cooperation to be solved even more fundamentally than they do on technology or on finance. And so we choose to read them as marketing briefs in disguise. We come together every month to upcycle our business and marketing skills to support a different pioneering charity or social enterprise, to coach and support each other in becoming more systemic leaders in the day jobs. And we also come together through our exchanges to explore some of the bigger stories that guide how we live and work and how we might change those stories for the better. If anyone is not yet a member of Marketing Kind and would like to become one, you can find out more at www.marketingkind.org. And of course, in this evening's conversation, we'll be exploring how all businesses might become as green as good energy.
And we've chosen exactly the right company to explore the question, because Juliet was not only founder and CEO of Good Energy, but has also written the book, The Green Startup, Make Your Business Better for the Planet. Juliet now sits on the boards of a whole collection of businesses tackling the climate emergency, including solar innovator Atrato On-Site Energy, which she chairs, pardon me, and which was the first company with an all-female board listed on the London Stock Exchange. Among many other distinctions, in 2013, Juliet was also awarded an OBE for services to renewables.
So welcome to Marketing Kind, Juliet. I have to say I've read The Green Startup twice. I love it. As I mentioned to you when we met, it feels like a real CEO's book. Partly because literally there is no word that goes to waste, but then even more literally, of course, it's a book for CEOs and entrepreneurs, present and future, and of course by a CEO. And I wanted to sort of go back to the start of when you became CEO and founded Good Energy and the circumstances that gave rise to that, because of course that was a little over 20 years ago. You didn't have the big track record that you have now, and you know, I can only imagine that starting an energy business is a pretty daunting thing to take on at any point. But then there was less clarity in most people's minds that there was a need for a complete new approach to energy. So sort of what prompted you to take on such an audacious mission, and what were the circumstances that made launching Good Energy possible?
Well, first of all, Paul, Mindy, thank you so much for inviting me here tonight and to listen to me. And thank you so much for reading the book twice, Paul. Amazing. Yeah, great commitment there. So if I go back at that time, I mean, I think, so I got interested in climate change partway through my degree. So I was studying physics. I knew nothing about climate change at that point. And I didn't know a huge amount about physics, to be honest, but I was struggling with the subject and struggling. I think what's interesting about university, and I was talking to an educator recently, is that it's the time we define what our education is going to do for us. So to a certain extent, up to A levels, we've kind of done education, but actually in university, quite often we begin to turn it around. And I hadn't found my path at that point in my degree until I read a Sunday Times article about climate change. And it was, and my third year, I got the opportunity to do atmospheric physics. And it seemed to make absolute sense that I should study a subject that I'd begun to get interested in a wider context. And so that was the kind of beginning of my journey, is that I did get interested and I was trying to figure out, okay, so how do I get into this? I did look at academia, but that wasn't, I had almost been banned from the labs at one point at university. There was one incident with a set of connected instruments for several of several sets of students, and ours had started to explode and then exploded everybody else's, at which point we left, and didn't necessarily weren't welcomed back. So I didn't think that kind of experimentation was necessarily the way forward for me. And I spent quite a long time just kind of doing jobs. And it's quite interesting when young people come and talk to me and say, like, I need to get into this industry. How do I get in? My personal view is the first thing anybody should do is go and get a job and just do some work, because understanding work, there's a piece in the book that from Guy at Riverford, where he talks about it's all very well being a sustainable company, but if you're not very good at what you do, then you're going to be slightly useless. So, and I think that for me, I worked in a hotel in the West Indies, not on sustainability at all, just learning how hotels operate, which was quite interesting, I guess. I came back, I worked in sports PR. Again, slightly odd. And I mean, these were all temp jobs that I just came across. I was still trying to get there on climate change, but these were other jobs I had to take in the meantime, which taught me how to sell a product, I guess, and talk about a product. I did some hospital radio at one point. That was quite fun, which taught me how to speak in public. And it wasn't until, and through this, I was beginning to think through, okay, so if I want to get into a sector, energy is where I think I can make a biggest difference. And if you looked at the biggest transformation at that point, if you started to do any research, energy was really the place to start. And I didn't know how to get into energy. So, I mean, there weren't any renewable energy. There were a few renewable energy companies, but nobody, unless you were an engineer, you weren't really going to be part of those. And so I did an internship in the European Commission on energy policy, and that was kind of the beginning of my journey into energy. I realized fairly fast that government was interesting, but not where I wanted to end up. But I'd done a load of work on what is the potential for renewables around Europe, what are the policies and processes that really accelerated them. And I was presenting at an event in Athens, actually, bizarrely, and I met a German entrepreneur, and we started talking about the fact that governments tend to move very slowly, and actually consumers can take risk and be far more progressive than sometimes we give them credit for, particularly early adopters and those kind of conscious consumer types. And we both were basically saying we'd like to have an energy company that goes directly to consumers. And I kind of built on that because I wanted to go beyond that and be a representation of the future. Because one of the things I'd learned in Brussels is that the only people who walked through the doors to influence politicians and regulators were the existing energy companies. You had the environmentalists, but they didn't talk about energy. They just talked about the environment at high level, which was great, but they didn't get into specifics. And so there was nobody in the room representing what a future energy company could look like. And I think it was a kind of combination of the two, the fact that you needed to move at speed and you also wanted to change government as well. So there were two pieces to it. And so he funded, the German entrepreneur funded the investment in the company in the first place. And I guess I got comfort that we were part of a European group. They then did go bust, so less comfort after about a year and a half. And that was quite a tricky period when we took administration services very seriously at that point, looked at our cash flow very carefully. It was all that time when you bump along the bottom with no cash, which wasn't much fun. But I guess all the time during that period, I kind of felt that I could start again. So, and that's what gave me the confidence, really, was that, well, okay, if this doesn't work, I'll go and try something else. And that's helpful. I found that helpful. Not everybody does. Some people need to be super positive and want to be thinking forward. I had to think about, for me personally, the way my resilience worked by going, well, if the worst comes to the worst, I can always move back in with my parents, because I was still at that age, I could do that. I think I was about 26 when we were going through some of those early bits. And then, so I could, if necessary, that I could do that. And and therefore it gave me confidence to take the right steps forward. And I think, and this is maybe just my personal take, make the right decisions. So not make decisions out of fear, but make the decisions out of thinking through and strategic decision making. Because if you get stuck in fear, it's really tough, I think, to be a leader.
And can you give us a snapshot of where Good Energy is up to today, and where has the business evolved in line with your original vision, and where has its development and impact surprised you most?
Yeah, so I mean, it went through whole stages of evolution during the time I was there, from partially necessity and opportunity. So once we got through the bumpy period that I talked to you about, I had a couple of high net worths who were invested in the business, who were on my board. And we'd gone and tried to see VCs and sort of raise some money and all those good things. And what we found is that obviously I was basically telling them that consumers would pay more for my product because it was a green product, and they all went, yeah, pull the other one. So none of them believed in the business plan. I also think, I mean, we still have a challenge with investors not believing in women leaders. I do think that is a challenge still today. I see some investors who don't get actually there's a slightly different leadership style, and I'm not saying that all men lead in the same way or women lead in the same way, but there's definitely I've seen a few too many times where there's been over promising, and investors love that because actually from their point of view they're taking 5 bets. So they prefer to have an over-promised bet that potentially, and then write off the other 4. So it's a very different approach. Whereas I always wanted to promise what I could do and probably wasn't ambitious enough. So we ended up crowdfunding. So we had some customers. They kept calling us. I was next to the call center, so I used to listen to calls quite a lot. And they kept saying, can we invest in the business? So I went to the chairman, and he and I wrote the prospectus together, which was quite hard work, I have to say. And he got cold feet the night before. It was hilarious. It was like, what do you mean? We've done all the work now. What have we got to lose if we send this out? So we sent it out, and we raised 600,000 in 2 weeks. So we got through that really tricky first bit, because we wanted to grow. So we wanted to invest in marketing. I wanted to de-risk the business because we'd outsourced some of our work. So I wanted to give us a backup plan if anything happened. And we bought some generation assets at the same time. So we did all of those things in one go. And that really then set us up in around 2002, really to then be able to move forwards in a really solid way. So yeah, and I don't think crowdfunding was really existed. I don't think it really existed. The platforms definitely didn't exist at that point. I'm not sure even the phrase had been coined at that point. We didn't call it that. I can't remember what we called it, but we called it customer investing or something. So yeah, so that was a really tough bit in terms of getting through. But what was interesting about that, and we did that several times over, but that led in about 2012 to us becoming listed. Because one of the things about being a PLC, because as soon as you have more over, I think it's 500 shareholders, you become a PLC. You need to have somewhere for people to sell their shares. And so at one point we had a match bargaining thing. So if people wanted to leave or unfortunately if they died or anything like those, that you had a platform that they could sell and buy. And we ended up sort of, that platform morphed into something called the Plus Markets. Which was a really early stage marketplace. Unfortunately, that went bust 3 years after. I did get CEO of the Year 3 years running, and then they went bust, which I felt rather sad about in some ways, which was a bit of a shame. But as a result of that, we had to then leap from Plus to AIM and list on AIM. And that was a big shift, Mindy, in terms of running the company, because suddenly you've gone from being a entrepreneurial, quite creative, innovative leader to essentially managing shareholders constantly. And as soon as you get into the listed space, it's a really, I chair the listed business. And I think you have to be, there's so many people who come to me and say, oh, I think we should list. And I'm thinking, no, you shouldn't. Because there's a very specific type of company that suits to being listed, one that kind of has good revenues. Startups are really tough to list because unless you've got good growth news all the time and high growth news, shareholders start to get frustrated if you don't grow fast enough. And we've experienced that in the last sort of 2 years with the company, one of the companies I've been working with. It's really tough. And unless you've got good news flow and telling people what's going to happen, they've got short memory flows of kind of 3 months. So if you're trying to establish a business and grow it, then it's much harder. So that I found really hard. And looking back on it, I kind of wish I'd moved to a more strategic position and brought in a CEO to run the AIM part of it and stayed as a kind of strategic founder or something. Because that, one, I think I would have enjoyed it more, and two, I think I could have pushed the company forward more at that point as well. Yeah. But we then, I guess, after that, we became really leading in decentralized energy. So we led the charge on empowering individuals to generate power in their own homes, not just buy power from us. And so we were one of the leading administrators and looking after the households to generate their own power. And we still are today. And the vision I kind of had when I left was to think about the complete customer experience. So talk about if you're decarbonizing as a household or as a business, you need to think about 3 key areas. One is your power supply. So how do you get the power into your home and where does it come from? And whether you generate power yourself. 2 is what is your future of transport? So are you going to move to EV or how are you going to transport yourself around? And that's whether you're an individual and charging. I think 80% of EV charging at the moment is still in people's homes. So suddenly you need a different set of propositions for home customers. And then the last one was about heat. Because decarbonising for heat is probably the biggest challenge the UK has. 80% of our households use gas central heating, which is why we've been so sensitive to what's happened in Ukraine and Russia. And our heating bills have been so extreme because we're so reliant on gas and have been for a long time. So those were the 3 elements. And I think since I've left, so one of the things I made the investment in before I left was a company called ZapMap, which is a mapping service for electric vehicles across the UK. So that was something I chaired and invested in before I left, and they carried on developing that. And I think they've raised some money into that as well since I left. The home generation and powering bit, that one of the things I always wanted to do, but we couldn't do it. Well, it's not that we couldn't do it. We didn't have space and time to do it. Is doing home generation. So they've now launched a solar proposition to consumers. And then the final one is the heating. And so they've launched a heat pump proposition to consumers as well. So the idea is eventually to tie it all together so that it becomes super easy for the household to decarbonize and then manage that decarbonisation.
Yeah. One of the things that a lot of people in marketing kind of really interested in is the whole notion of corporate purpose. I mean, our own purpose as well, but also corporate purpose. And, listening to you, those early crowdfunders must have been all over the mission. The early generators must have thought that you were sort of manna from heaven, that finally they could plug their initiatives into something. On the other hand, some of the other investors may have been less orientated around the mission. As you grew the business, what did having a purpose-led approach mean? And were there any sort of key inflection points where you had to articulate your purpose and your sense of mission differently at different scales of business? I remember, reading in the book, there was one point early on when a colleague said, we don't need a value statement, we just have Juliet's values. But presumably there came a point when you had to sort of formalize things a little bit.
Well, probably after that, because I felt very uncomfortable about that. Because what is somebody's personal? Generally, okay, you can take your whole person to work, but there are you don't necessarily want a company to be like you in a way. There are many flaws I wouldn't necessarily pass on. I mean, what you're trying to do with a company in a sense is take the best bits of everybody and put it into the company. You don't want to take all the baggage as well. So I think that was a point where I kind of went, oh yes, maybe we should think about our values and articulate them rather than just having them around me. Because I mean, there were some hilarious conversations. So the talk about purpose, we did define a purpose really quite early on, and that was led sort of the chair at the time, John Sellers, really supported me in doing that. However, he was a finance guy and an auditor, and I'm a bloody scientist, right? I'm a scientist. And so we came up with quite a dry statement, and it was before anybody really talked about purpose, so nobody could cut. We had a couple of people advising us, but we came up with keeping the world a habitable place, which can mean many things. I think we morphed that to powering a greener, cleaner world. And we actually, quite not long before I left, we did almost like a piece of poetry as a mission statement. And I can't remember it off the top of my head, but I did read it. I basically said, I want to be able to stand on a podium and read this and make something emotional connection with people. Because, I mean, and we talked about clean air, clean water, a planet that we can breathe on in the future, and promoting that through transformation of the energy sector. So I think it's incredibly powerful. What was interesting is who purpose was important to was very much our customers and those very early shareholders, because they were one and the same. I think we had 600 people invest in that early stage. And they became, we did various other fundraisers over the years. We probably did 3 more with our customer base. And after we listed, so I had a hilarious conversation with our broker at the time, and he said, oh, I can go. We put a new business plan together, which was about investing in solar. And the broker said to me, I put the plan together, he said, I'll go and raise you 10 million, no problem at all. Anyway, 2 million later, when he hadn't raised me 10 million, I said, okay, it's my turn now. I'll go and raise us some money. And so I went back to our customer base and I did a green bond, and we raised 15 million within 2 weeks, again, from our customer base. And so what's interesting is that I think the purpose and the mission was incredibly important to those people who both invested and were good energy customers. I think to the wider investment market, they didn't really care at that point. But I think also during all that time, the mission, the vision was really important to our employees. We had a bit of I think I talk about it in the book, where I talk about where we had to do a reverse takeover of our sister company who provided our outsourced services. And that was when, that's when we had a clash of visions, definitely within the teams. And that was really tough. And I learned my lesson afterwards is like, make sure you spend a lot of time agreeing on values when you bring 2 teams. I think we were in such sort of flight mode at that point that I didn't have time to think. But I wish I'd had somebody go, you need to think carefully about bringing these 2 cultures together because they're not the same. And that was really tough for a bit. But what's interesting is I think the inflection point on purpose has happened in the wider investment market now in the last 2 to 3 years.
Thank you. In marketing, we often love to create a customer persona, and in your book, you describe some of Good Energy's early customers as rebels and wellies. What kinds of relationships has Good Energy built with customers over the years, and what can you tell us about some of the most dedicated customers and the people who have actively driven the business and its impact forwards?
I think that's a really interesting question. Customer personas were always quite tricky because we were kind of trying to define a kind of new area. So what I found in the early days is there were a lot of people who tried to put people in boxes and they didn't quite work. I mean, my experience was that a lot of the customers, the original customers, were thoughtful. They were interested in what we had. They were information seekers. So what you ended up having to do was provide a lot of information. So our website was a bit clunky to begin with, but had huge amounts of swathes of information on renewable energy, on climate change, And that's what they wanted. They wanted this kind of information piece very much, so that they felt informed. And I mean, I remember in some of our early newsletters, we were writing things about migration and the impact of climate change on migration, which is now a thing, and sort of talking through some of that. And they wanted to have these kinds of conversations with their energy company about the implications of climate change in a wider context. We did a big article on wine and how migration of vineyards, again, that was about 20 years ago. So it was those kind of conversations they wanted us to have. But coming across them was always really odd. I went to a hypnobirthing class when I was pregnant, and I came across a couple of Good Energy customers, and it was really funny because I didn't admit to who I was, partially because I just couldn't face doing hypnobirthing and dealing with customers at the same time. My brain just wouldn't work in that sphere. But yeah, so yeah, it was interesting where you came across them, but they tended to be they would be a member of probably a large charity who was environmental facing. They were very thoughtful. They enjoyed reading and they enjoyed information.
Wonderful. You've talked about involving some of the sort of early passionate customers, the generators, the people who did the crowdfunding, the people who really wanted to understand energy better. I'm interested in how you're moving to a more mainstream market. I mean, it's a huge business today, and I understand the target is to be up to 1 million customers by the end of next year.
Yeah.
There's a fantastic chapter in the book on marketing, of course. And how do you make that shift from the early adopters to the mainstream? Because in energy, I mean, right now, of course, people are suddenly very interested in energy because of the exorbitant bills. But over the time that you were growing Good Energy, energy is such an opaque thing.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't use energy because we want to use it, you know, apart from when you're at school and you use the Van de Graaff machine to put your hair on it. And so it's very kind of, most of us don't understand how energy works. You've got comparing things that all fit in the energy category that don't seem to go together, like, you know, electricity, gas and food. So what was key to sort of accessing and mobilizing a much more mainstream market?
So I think first of all is simplicity of language, and I think trying to make sure that you don't overcomplicate things. So in some of our original blogs, we would have a lot of detail about climate change and all the impacts and stuff. Keeping it simple, making it much more accessible in terms of access to that. And actually, because over time, remember, I mein, social media didn't really exist when, well, definitely, I don't think it existed at all. I can't really remember when social media really started to kick off, but obviously, my view is some of the best things that we used. We got some funding to make some films about renewable energy in, oh God, I can't remember when it was. It was about 2010, I think. And it was before, we ended up using a BBC producer, and those films got so much hit. And I think the point was to try and it's a bit like teaching. So I used to teach maths and physics many years ago. And I always remember this one kid that I taught, he wanted to be a film producer, but he needed to get O-level, I think it was at that point, so maybe it was GCSE maths, because you kind of always have to. And quite often we didn't talk about maths. We talked about his ambitions and what he wanted to do. And occasionally I would try and link maths into the subjects he was interested in. Because he was completely capable of understanding it. It's just nobody had shown him a route through it. And I guess that was the same as what we tried to do with Good, was to try and make it more accessible, try and find ways through that really allowed it to resonate with other people and didn't exclude them. Because a lot of the time, scientific language is very exclusive. It doesn't encourage people to engage. And so I think over time, what you can see, if you see the modern stuff that Good is now using, it's quite simple language. We did a lot of press, actually. So I had a really fantastic head of comms who who gave me enough confidence to go on things like the Today program and do a lot more sort of that comms type work, and start to talk about what we were trying to change and who we were trying to be. So I think that was a key route. But making short films, I think the short film stuff is just so powerful when you're trying to educate an audience. And it's not educate as in I'm being terribly wordy, but obviously you want them to buy into what you do, but you need to take them on the journey because it's not straightforward.
Before we dive further into the advice in your book for non-energy businesses, as energy is so important, how would you grade the state of our national progress on energy today? And what in the energy landscape in the UK currently gives you most concern and most hope?
Okay, so I kind of fit it into 5 brackets of things that we need to do to accelerate it. The first thing is sort of each country around the world invests in research and innovation. And although, Paul, I agree with you, we have a lot of the technologies, we still need to be evolving them, improving them, improving the process of how we use them. I mean, we still don't have a fantastic innovation in how to retrofit Victorian terraced houses with energy efficiency. And I think we still need to be working on all of those things. And the last 20 years, we've spent virtually nothing in this area. So my view is we've seen it improve this area, but it's an area we still need to focus on. So it's an improving area, research and innovation, but not enough yet. The next one is infrastructure. So we built most of the infrastructure in this country during a high carbon world. So whether that was the internal combustion engine, so we built lots of roads, and we invest in roads and we subsidize rail, if anybody remembers that comment from Mrs. Thatcher. So we definitely felt that we should, so rail has been underinvested in for many years, and we have big infrastructure in terms of the car. We also have huge infrastructure in terms of gas pipeline infrastructure. So the UK, we never see it because it's all underground. We have a huge number of gas pipelines that support all our houses. So 80% of our households are heated by gas right now. So, and that's going to have to shift if you want to hit your zero carbon targets. And finally, we built the electricity system, which has massive pylons all the way down the side. We're kind of, or if you think about it, like sort of a tree going off each part, feeding the demand centers. Originally, I think it was 30 years ago, we had about 30 power stations. We've now got over 1 million. And they're all over the place, and they're all feeding power the other way, which was a bit of a shock to National Grid probably about 20 years ago. And so that system is, we do not have enough infrastructure to be able to deal with significant investment in offshore wind, particularly. There's not enough capacity to bring that amount of power onshore and then deliver it to where energy needs are. So that's a big challenge for me, is that infrastructure play. Regulation and finance, to be honest, finance was doing okay until we had Liz Truss moment, which has caused a lot of problems, because obviously with interest rates so high and what's happened more recently with the Bank of England, it means that the cost of investing in this infrastructure is much more. So normally you would raise equity, put the equity to work in infrastructure, and then raise debt as well to be able to leverage your equity investment. You can't do that right now because the cost of debt is so high. So that means that we've got less capital going into these areas right now, and I think we're seeing a slowdown. That's going to come down to macroeconomic policy around interest rates and what's going on worldwide. The next one is consumers, so greenwashing. Big issue. I don't know, I think Shell just had an ASA go against them for 3 adverts they put in last year. I mean, my personal view is that's not enough. If adverts are greenwashing, you don't get fined for it. You just have to remove the ads. And those ads went out in 2021 and the findings just come through now. So it's like, well, what do you do if they've already gone? So I think we need to think about how we present these products. Because if you believed all the claims all over the world, then we would have sorted climate change already.
Yeah.
And then finally, people. So we don't have enough skilled workforce at the moment to manage this energy transition. So it's a big gap. And some of the work I do with the Energy Institute is about professional development. And that's something we need to start to fast track for people who want to come into this sector. One, make it more attractive as a sector to get more people into it and get them to understand that actually this is a massive challenge and really fascinating. But also think about how we might train people, because the university capacity is full pretty much at the moment. So how do we start to use technical colleges? How do we use schools? How do we start to train people up at an earlier stage in their careers? So and we don't need them all to be engineers, but understanding the principles of what we're trying to do in other career areas like comms is really important.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, there's so much there that hopefully we'll get a chance to dive into together. I mean, it's all the news headlines, really, isn't it, at the moment? You know, our people who currently work in oil and gas are going to be able to find jobs in green energy that are sort of appropriately at the kind of level that they feel they've become qualified for in oil and gas. You know, in greenwashing, we've just seen FIFA rebuked for greenwashing all over the World Cup, claiming it as the first major carbon neutral event. And of course, all around the world, renewable projects, often the bottleneck is, you know, maybe having to wait 5, 6, 7, even 8 years to be able to plug that energy into a national grid. But let's turn back to the book and advice for all businesses. So I would say this is probably the most practical book on sustainable business I've ever read. And
thank you. Well, that's a great compliment, because that was the idea behind it. It was trying to be practical.
Oh yeah, this book will stare at you if you don't do something with it. And you've got sort of 3 pathways that you bring to life at the end of each chapter, which are the quick wins, moving up a gear and really going for it. And this is kind of putting you on the spot a bit, but you know, could you bring to life for us what you meant by those 3 pathways, or maybe give us some examples for, you know, what that looks like for a business to go for the quick wins, move up a gear, or really go for it on green?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea was to try and not freak people out when they start on this journey. It was to be inclusive in a sense, because not every business starts in the same place, and not everybody has time to start in the same place. And I think the concept of the quick wins was really to get people comfortable about moving forward on sustainability, because quite often, 1, sustainability is a very large word. 2, it doesn't necessarily mean the same to everybody. In fact, it doesn't mean the same to everybody. And 3, it's quite impenetrable. So the idea of the book was to give some very practical examples of where you start, and what are the first kind of steps that you can take, whether it's looking at your transport policy as a business. So what's your expenses policy? Have you talked to your teams about how they get from one place to another? And do you, by mistake, incentivize them to be a high carbon traveler as opposed to a low carbon traveler? And I think it's kind of going through that and just remembering, actually, every stage of our business, potentially we can make different decisions. And the idea was to just give the quick wins is all about making some simple changes that your finance team won't have a heart attack about, and that they will get used to. And then when you come to them with the next one, once you've made the first one and made the case for the one, they all go, yeah, that's brilliant. But then you learn how to make the case for the next ones. And that was the idea of the progression through the process. So whether you start with, on transport, you start with just saying, well, we prefer you to go by train than take a car. So that's the first bit. And then the second bit is, actually, we are going to help you buy your own bike, put EV and help you buy your own EV, or are we going to put a completely EV station in the bottom of the car park to make sure that everybody can charge when they come to work? So it's kind of a progression. And I think sometimes what happens is, I've seen lots of consultancy reports on sustainability where it looks really hard work, and And quite often people just don't start because it looks too hard. It's a bit like going on a diet, isn't it? I mean, when you want to change something in your life, if it seems too hard, it's like going for a 10-mile run. Let's start with 500 meters and then move up to it. And that was the concept.
I just have to echo Paul's words on that one. I found it super practical, and I've been recommending because it's just so easy to implement. And oh yeah, I loved it.
Good.
So you've written the book at a time when you've moved on to a portfolio career,
Yeah.
and many of our members, myself included, are in our own versions of that kind of transition. What has been most important to you in making the switch, and what advice would you give our members in making a success of such a change?
So I think the most important thing for me was to define what I would do and what I wouldn't do. Because I think once you've decided to start, so one of the most difficult things about going plural is that you don't get all the jobs at the same time. And you start with somebody might either approach you, or you might go to a headhunter, or you might apply for something. So when you start, you don't replace what you left behind, depending on your salary requirement. You just don't walk into another job. You walk into maybe 5 other jobs, and they don't all come at the same time. So I think one of the things I'm sort of getting there now, as because it's been 2 or 3 years now. But one of the things I did was really define what areas I'm going to work in, and what is a yes and what is a no. So if somebody brings, actually it was probably quite a good decision looking at the news coverage over the last year and a half, but probably one of the first jobs I was asked to go and do was chair a water company. Maybe I should have gone and done it, but I don't think I'd be having much fun right now, put it that way. So and I think also I found it slightly hard. So I do find it harder when I'm the only female on the board from a gender diversity point of view, because it's just tougher. I mean, it's not awful, but it just makes life a bit harder, because sort of the way you communicate is different, and you are very different, and you're slightly isolated. So it's a pushing through. I mean, I push through and say exactly what I want to say, even so, but it's just tougher. Whereas the more diverse boards are just much more fun, to be honest. So there's a kind of bit of two things in one there. One, it has to be around climate change, solving climate change, absolutely sort of underlying. And that's in that. So I do things like I do the energy ombudsman, and the reason I do that is my view is the future around consumer protection on energy, but also around emerging products. So whether that's EV charging, or whether that's new technologies in people's homes, we're going to see more and more of that. And I think consumer protection around that's really important. And then Crown Estate, that's about infrastructure, really. So that's all about the offshore wind infrastructure piece. But both of those roles, what's really interesting is it overlaps into other areas I've never done before. So Crown Estate overlaps into property. So I haven't come from a property background, but I get to push sustainability across the whole property portfolio at Crown Estate, which is great. And then at Ombudsman, they do telecoms as well. So I haven't done telecoms before. Parking, interestingly, we also cover parking complaints. If you ever want to complain about parking, I can tell you where to do that. But for me, what's fascinating about that is that if you bring EV charging and parking together, you're going to end up with complaints about EV charging and parking. So yeah, it does have a theory behind it, and I think it stood me in pretty good stead. And I sort of slightly rushed a few things to begin with because I was nervous, but actually, if you can be as relaxed as possible, don't try and also you don't want them all at the same stage. You want different, because I quite like the Ombudsman because they know what they're doing. They're not a startup. That's really nice. And so I don't have to worry about board papers not being completely incomprehensible and things like that. So yeah.
It's certainly very brave to invite people to get in touch if they have complaints about their parking.
I will be passing them on to the Ombudsman. I will be.
I once met the head of the commercial head of British Telecom, and that is somebody who really does receive a large number of complaints.
Yeah.
We want to involve everyone in discussion. So you know, Mindy and I have a ton more questions, but after this one, we might sort of weave in questions from the group if anyone would like to either post in the chat, or if you raise your digital hand, then Mindy and I can come to you to get your questions and comments. But I wanted to ask a question about resilience. I mean, I think for all of us, we've maybe had a sense in the last few years that something we've had to come to terms with is that often the biggest determinants of our success or lack of it can be things that, you know, what the economists call exogenous variables, or you know, what I call the things that take us by surprise and that we don't feel we have much influence over, let alone control over. And of course, in energy, you know, you're subject to changes in regulation, legislation, subsidies, geopolitical events, and, you know, even Juliet Davenport isn't in charge of all those things. So how do you, on the one hand, sort of cope with knowing that so much of your plans come to fruition or otherwise due to forces beyond your control? Or alternatively, are you just very astute at using those advantageously wherever possible?
Yeah, I actually think it's a combination of that. So, I mean, my personal view and the bit I really enjoyed, if I go back one step, the bit I really enjoyed before I became CEO was forward looking. So I did a lot of future thinking and future modeling in energy markets. That's kind of what I did. And so my view of a CEO, if you have a big enough organization, that's what your job becomes. You do become a crystal ball gazer, because it is your job to look out for the icebergs in the future. And so even if you can't stop them, you at least know how you might navigate them. And I can't remember how many energy crises we went through, quite a few, but part of it was making sure you've got a reasonable hedging strategy, always good in an energy market, which is why most of the energy players went bust in the last rounds, into the last couple of years, because they didn't have that. And it's not rocket science. If you sell forward at a fixed price and you don't buy forward, potentially if the market price goes up, you will lose money. But they'd all be making money to that point, and then but then you get an exogenous shock and then you're dead, which is what happened. So I think that's not rocket science. That's just about saying, I'm not prepared to take that risk, and I can look forward and I can see it. I think then, in terms of other sort of external shocks, yeah, you pivot as an organization. You keep an eye on what politics are doing, because they love meddling in bloody energy markets, don't they? And you also influence. I mean, your job is not just to sit there and respond. You should also use your influence where you can to. So I spent a whole period of time on the board of Energy UK, which was about trying to influence government in the right way and be another voice in the room other than all the big six players. I think there's a bit in the book I talk about when I went to a breakfast meeting or lunch with Vince Cable, Secretary of State at the time, and he kind of asked the question about solar, and I think it was the CEO of Centrica turned around and said, well, it's not very sunny in the UK, Minister. I was like, and so just with that very small dismissive voice could dismiss the whole of a sector. And that's what used to happen behind closed doors. It was that kind of, nobody would actually out and out. It's a very English way of undermining sort of different technologies, but that's what they do. And obviously I put my hand up and said, that's rubbish, blah, 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 blah. And actually within 2 years, we had something like sort of 12 gigawatts of solar on the system, unbeknownst to all these energy companies. So maybe we wouldn't have got them if they'd seen it coming. But in that time, we did see it coming. So we made sure we were well positioned to take advantage of that and be a leading light in that. So I think that is your job as a CEO. If you can get to the point where you're beyond survival and sort of move into growth, and you've got sort of a good regular income, then your job is to look forward and make sure you then guide the business.
Have we got time for one more question before we go? The questions coming in, or
let's interweave them. I just think Suleiman's had his hand up for a while, and then let's come back and interweave with the group.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. And I want to say, Juliet, I look forward to read the book. I started when you were talking still to download it and go to the Amazon and see. So it's very exciting. I'm social entrepreneur. My name is Suleiman Abdullah. I run a charity, a small charity based in Northern Ireland, Horn of Africa, people say Northern Ireland. One of the area I am interested in is to look for renewable energy and the climate change and the climate action, how the innovation can save lives. I'm originally from Somalia, and the drought and the climate impact is massive, and people lost their livelihood. And we have 12 hours of sunlight in Africa, but there's no infrastructure in terms of the. So would your company interested to expand into African continent, and make billions of dollars and make life easier for those people in education, health, business, interconnectivity of the world, of the internet, everything depended on energy. And if you are very strategic, and I believe that what you have done is amazing and it's replicatable. And I wonder if you can give a piece of advice for those people who really have real opportunity but not exploiting it. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you, Suleiman, for that question. And you're right. I mean, Africa is an absolutely obvious place to be developing solar and innovations around solar, because obviously you have huge amounts of sun hours already, and two, you have a huge need. So there's still a lot of people in Africa who have no electrification or no power at all. And I think what we're beginning to see is some of the countries. So I know I've just been talking to a friend of mine actually who lives just down the road here, who's doing, they're not doing solar, actually doing biogas in Nigeria, and beginning to look at biogas there. And I know Nigeria is led on solar as well. And I think you're beginning to see South Africa take a lead on solar as well, because they have so many power cuts and storage. One of the biggest challenges for businesses investing in developing in countries around the world is what the legislation and what the governments do, and that is probably one of the most difficult areas. And quite often, in some ways, it's almost better to work with a charity in place and then use a company in another domain where it can actually drive profitability somewhere else, and then support sort of a charity approach in those countries. I also think we should be looking at innovations around these technologies that can support multiple purposes. So can we look at innovation around solar and agriculture and linking it together so that you can re-establish, particularly where you can get shading from solar, and we've seen this already being developed at a European level, where you see solar working closely with things like vines, where you get some form of protection from the technology itself in terms of the agriculture. So I would love to see more innovation in that space. And actually, I think it's an area where charities like yourselves could work with universities based in the UK and apply for funding from people like Innovate UK for those types of technologies, because I think bringing together food and energy is going to be so important if we're going to solve these problems.
Wonderful. So we've got Sita Mara will come to you shortly. But Mindy, did you have another question you wanted to?
Well, there was just really one around, I guess, the impact that you would like the Green Startup to have, Juliet. You've obviously had impact through the business. You're raising questions through the podcast that you have, but in terms of the time and effort that you dedicated to the book, what was the kind of the greater impact that you like that to have?
So I think I get asked a lot of questions, Mindy, sort of from people who are either running businesses or wanting to start up businesses. And so really it's a handbook for them. So the impact I'd love to have, and although it's called the Green Startup, what I found is it's got relevant information for organizations as large as the Crown Estate, who are looking at, so they rent property in central London. They're looking at the sustainability of the property that they rent as office space in London. And there's a whole section on Huckletree in the book, which is a kind of sustainable WeWork with a fantastic organization in London. And actually Crown Estate are now working with Huckletree. So I think it's about catalyzing change in as many places as possible. So that's what I want to do with it, get as many people to read it, share it, talk about it, but also learn from it so that they can go and do these things themselves and be empowered to make change themselves and be change agents.
Sita and Mara, are you ready to make change?
We do our bit. So I'm Sita, and I run a small charity called Settle Stories, which is focused about the arts, and we're running a festival this year which is focused around social justice and climate justice. And one of the questions that comes to me is about how do we get energy equity. You spoke at the beginning about the fact that you were persuading your investors that your customers would pay more for your product, which is great. But what happens when you're poor?
Completely. And I think this is a real point about the change in marketplaces. So when you see new technologies come in, quite often you can't necessarily deliver them at the lowest cost. And so what you need is your early adopters to help you bring those products to market, and then so that you can bring the price down. So if you look at the price of solar panels have dropped in price by like 90% since 2015, I think it is. And that's been just purely because of people adoption and scale. And that right now, so I think it's a really interesting challenge in the UK. Cheapest way to buy power right now in the UK is to put a solar panel on your roof or in your garden or out back, basically. But most people do not have the cash to be able to go and afford to do that. And to be able to borrow cash right now is really expensive. So that is actually where the blocker is about capital to be able to invest in these, because it's by far cheaper to buy that. We are doing rooftop solar for businesses with the company that I work with. And right now, business cost of energy is something like 30 to 40 pence per kilowatt hour. And we can sell them power at 12 pence. And so what that means is hopefully we're working with the food industry, that we can help the food industry reduce their costs so they can then reduce their costs they pass on to their consumers.
That's pretty good. So but just coming back to that though, is what happens though in terms of the solar panels and the in terms of the recycling around solar panels, because my understanding is they last for 25 years and then we can't recycle them. And so how do we manage all of that as well?
So what's really interesting about the recyclability of solar panels, we can recycle them. We don't have the facilities to recycle them today. And the reason we don't have the facilities to recycle them today is that they last for more than 25 years. They last for 40 years. So there's no panels to recycle right now. So there's no point in having a business to recycle panels. So we've got this sort of so there was a discussion, I think it was on the BBC the other day, about the fact that we can't recycle plants. Well, you can recycle most things. You've just got to build a factory to do it. But there was absolutely no point in building a factory today because there aren't going to be any panels to recycle for at least another 20 years. So the point is to keep investing. The reason I talk about innovation and research investing is so important. That's where we should be investing in recyclability now, to make sure that we'll be ready with all the techniques and capability to create those organizations that need to do the recycling in 20 years' time.
It won't be long before everyone's talking about COP28. And I just wanted to get some of your thoughts on that, because, on the one hand, some people say, well, it's in UAE. There's already talk of focusing on atmospheric sequestration rather than just cutting back on oil and gas. How activists going to feel being in a location where protests aren't allowed. On the other hand, you might say that the nature of the problem is it's just too important to have a bad attitude. So how do you feel about COP28, and is there a way to make a success of it?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I don't necessarily have a great answer. I think that for me the point is that we are not going to solve climate change by being exclusive. So we are going to have conversations with everybody, whether we like them or not, basically. And so I think the challenge is, and there will still be some fossil fuels that we produce, even when we go through 2050, if we hit all our targets. So, and interesting, the Middle East is probably where we'll produce it because it's the cheapest place to produce it right now. So we need them to decarbonize those fossils that they do have, and that we will. So there will be a certain percentage. I can't remember. I did some estimates. If you took the UK 100% green, you'd still need to decarbonize about 10%. 10% of the energy would come from fossil fuel that you then need to decarbonize. So we still need that technology to do that. We can't just ignore it, but it shouldn't be an excuse not to then deliver everything else. I mean, what I think is quite interesting is that renewables are now cheaper than building new fossil fuel power stations. So they are cheaper. The biggest issue we've got is connecting them to the infrastructure. So the infrastructure question is the biggest challenge, not just in the UK, but worldwide. And so I think if it's, as long as we are having those conversations about how do you accelerate funding into these areas, and how do you accelerate, because one of the biggest challenges is we're going to have to put a load more pylons up, and generally the UK is not that happy about having more pylons built next to them, which is one of the reasons they've done a big design. I don't know if anybody's seen them. It's a big design program to design better pylons, prettier pylons, basically. They're just deploying some in the southwest, just trying them out and seeing how they impact. But I think this whole concept of we know we have the technology to do the transformation. A lot of the transformation, Paul, I think coming back to your point at the beginning, is about communication, storytelling, and acceptance of these technologies and use of these technologies by us, not by somebody else, by us. And so I think if there are important conversations at UAE, one is making sure that we are engaging with everybody. We keep talking to everybody, because if we start excluding people, it's just not going to work. Whether we'll get them to go fast enough or not, we just need to keep trying. And my view is, I think it's a great opportunity, if it's there, to have as many conversations as possible. And it's a different country, we won't be able to protest, but the rest of us, we don't all need to protest. We can go and talk and be activists without actually having to protest.
Wonderful. I might invite Meredith, has put a question in the chat. If you're able to come on mic though, Meredith, I might ask you to put your question directly in case I don't do it justice. And if not, we'll come to it next. Is that okay?
Yeah, no, that's fine. Just multitasking a little bit at the moment with the family. So excuse me if there's any interruptions. I don't know if I'll do it justice as well. So firstly, the scenario is that there's the demand from the digitization of everything. So everything is becoming digitized. That puts a lot of pressure on energy systems and connectivity, etc. But then there is the supply. And so is that coming off the grid that everyone else is competing for, or starting to see like the co-location of renewable energy sources, with that business operation, or even regenerative infrastructure that might create a more circular type on-site scenario.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that doing that co-location in some way could be quite game-changing, especially you just talked about connectivity, not just necessarily the production side. So yeah, I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that, and where you see this in the future, and is it a feasible and way to go?
If I try and re-explain the question back, so I make sure I've got it.
Yeah.
What you're asking me is, we're going to have a huge amount of additional use around electricity, power particularly, which is completely true. So we've got lots of pressures. Digitization is part of it, but also electrification of transport, electrification of heat. So a lot of pressure on the system. You're completely right. We're also moving to a world where we're going to be using natural resources essentially to produce power. So we're using the sun and the wind predominantly in the UK, and they aren't predictable. So you can predict them probably about a day out, and you can have seasonality to them, but they do change. And so you're going to have flexibility within that system built in. And that potentially is where you might have an opportunity for co-location. So one of the discussions at the moment is where you're seeing significant offshore wind coming in from the North Sea into the northeast of the country. can we start to create these co-locational hubs? So we potentially can produce some hydrogen from excess renewables. Hydrogen particularly is useful. So there's many places you can use hydrogen, and there's this big debate about where you should use hydrogen. My personal view is you should use it in very high temperature industrial processes. And so again, perfect for co-location. So you end up with a sort of northeastern hub where you have heavy industry plus green hydrogen production plus offshore wind coming in, and you can create these industrial hubs. I mean, I think we're going to probably see another one in South Wales. And actually what would be great is if we start to, because the Celtic Sea offshore wind hub is likely to come into South Wales, they're going to need deep ports to manage a lot of this offshore wind. So again, you're going to see some of that rehabilitation of those regions that were industrial heartlands before. And so that is the opportunity, is to take industrial heartlands and invest in them and expand them. And actually, one of the other things, so slightly randomly off to one side, there's a book out by Madeline Bunting on seaside towns. And one of the issues with seaside towns is that they miss most of the statistical reviews because they're too small. And what we're seeing is this massive sort of erosion of social equity within seaside towns. And for me, therefore, if we're going to be doing a lot around our coastline, which we are in terms of industrial process, this is a massive opportunity for us to start to include that as well, in terms of thinking about how do we reinvigorate some of the seaside areas where we've seen a massive sort of exodus. One, because people go abroad on holiday, and two, because people want to move towards where they want to have jobs. And actually, can we reinvigorate both of those at the same time? So you look at your industrial hubs, but you also look at your connectivity to your towns around the coast.
Wonderful.
Thanks very much. I mean, I can just see these circular models popping up everywhere, which just solves so many challenges. But anyway, we have.
And what the answer to how you get there is you have to, at every stage, you have to keep asking the question, can we do more?
Yeah. And speaking of doing more, I want to get to what may be a final question on what more governments and particularly mayors may be able to do. But Shri put an intriguing question in the chat. When dealing with a sustainable enterprise, which is very mission-led, of course, that mission becomes really important to you, and the people who get involved in the early stages have a burning desire to bring about change. So how do you make sure that you actually build an early team which is aligned around the same vision for change? Because people can, quite legitimately have slightly different versions of what they prioritize in creating change and the mechanisms for going about it. So how do you make sure that that you get your early team decisions right in building a sustainable enterprise?
So I think it comes back to the point that you should have brought up earlier, when the finance director turned around and said, well, we just deal with Juliet's values and purpose. You have to do quite a lot of work with the team to discover it and to understand it. And one of the challenges, at one point we had a value that we did some workshopping on, but we didn't really do a lot of work in making sure it was engaged with the overall organization. We had ethical as a value. And ethical is quite a tricky value because a lot of people interpret it in completely different ways, depending on where you're coming from. And that it took me a while to figure that out. I should have done already, but yeah. And so I was looking at some of our stats on our debt collection. So debt collection when you're an energy company is pretty important, making sure you've got cash coming in. And they were looking pretty poor. And I went to talk to the debt team. And essentially what came out of the conversation is they felt that it was unethical to collect debts. And it was this fantastic sort of standoff moment. It's like, oh, yes, this is different perceptions of a value really don't necessarily help. And therefore we then had to have the conversation was like, well, if you don't collect the debt from them, then are the other customers going to have to pay for their debt? So how does that work? And what are the implications of it further than just that one snapshot decision? But yeah, a lot of work talking about what it means and showcasing what it means as well. So we did a lot of awards talking about the values and got people to explain when they were using them and just vocalizing it and trying to bring those through. So that was really important. I actually think it's harder because to a certain extent when you're growing and you're young and you're sort of, although you may not be completely aligned, you tend to be very clear that you're going in a direction. When you're quite a lot bigger and some parts of the business are not necessarily in fast growth, they're kind of in process and improvement. That can be harder because it's harder to find people who've got the experience at that level who also have the passion. And that's one of the things I made mistakes in, definitely, was hiring people who I should have spent much more time interviewing them about their personal purposes and whether they were aligned with the culture of the business. And I didn't spend enough time sometimes at that. And that was a learning that I took away to a certain extent.
Speaking of interviewing people on purpose, our next exchange actually will be with the Mayor of Manchester, Andy Burnham.
Right.
And so I wondered if you might have some thoughts. I mean, it looks currently on balance of probability as if the next government to be formed would be a Labour government.
Mm-hmm.
And then specifically, we have the chance to talk to Andy, Mayor of Manchester, in September. So if you had some time alone with Andy Burnham, or if you had a question or a point to put to him, what would you most like to impress upon him or ask him, and how confident are you that a Labour government would bring in an effective green industrial policy?
So I think they're definitely trying to think about it at the moment. So definitely that. I mean, I think for me, the key blocker is how do you build enough network infrastructure to deliver what we have is a fantastic home product of renewable, offshore wind. So it's like, so what can Manchester do itself? I mean, how much power needs to come into Manchester? Where do we need to build that? It's a bit more difficult for a city because you won't be putting as much infrastructure in there, but what can they do about that? I think also for me, probably Manchester could look at, well, how are they going to skill up the next workforce to make sure that we've got sufficient people to go out and deliver on the zero carbon targets.
Wonderful.
Well, I think we're almost out of time, I'm afraid. So sorry for the questions that we didn't manage to get to. Juliet, thank you so much. There's a phrase that you quote in the book, which has been handed down as a family tradition at Wick Farms, that if you look after nature, nature will look after you.
Yeah.
Your book makes enterprise a powerful vehicle for making both sides of that equation work. So thank you so much for spending this time with us. Really, really appreciated. Really appreciate it. Absolutely love the book and can't recommend it highly enough.
Oh, Mindy, thank you. And I really enjoyed what brilliant conversation this evening. Thank you very much for both you and Paul, and all the fantastic questions as well.
Thank you. And just a couple of reminders for our members regarding our upcoming gatherings. We have a Coffee with the Cause with Mentor Mums, which I'll be hosting on June 28th. Your Marketing Kind with Rob Harrison Plasto on unlocking emotional insights on July the 5th, and a digital fireside with web psychologist Natalie Nahai on how we can flourish in the age of AI on July the 11th. And as a reminder for any non-members, if you would like to join us, please check out marketingkind.org. And thank you all and have a lovely sunny evening.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Juliet.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.